Howdy of you delicious people. I am here today to review Season 2 of Atypical. So, recently after watching the first season, I immediately was just like, meh, let's watch the second season. Normally, I would probably just call it a wrap and just kind of do other things and then maybe eventually come back at this, but I'm like, you know what? I just like this show. Normally, I honestly and truly don't go into having a show that is very family focused. Because normally I would like to have individual people that I could really invest in instead of like a whole family of people. I think the last time I otherwise, besides this show, really got into like a family kind of show was probably the OC. I think that was the thing that I reviewed and ultimately talked about, which ultimately I'd already seen years and years and years ago. But ultimately, yeah, reasonably, I thoroughly enjoyed that show, and so ultimately, when going into this, I was like, kind of feeling good about this show. I'm feeling good about it. I think kind of now let's go into talking about season 2 of this. Reasonably, I think the stories were very strong in the first season. I think in this season, it's kind of like the aftermath of those strong stories kind of thing. It's kind of like a, I wouldn't call it exactly a victory lap because there is some interesting things going on in this season. I think Casey has some interesting developments going on into this show, and everybody else is kind of just reasonably there, to be brutally honest. Like, we have some things going on with Elsa, which can kind of be intriguing, but I feel like everybody is really, besides Casey, I think everybody's just kind of there in this season. They're just there, but it's just not as every single one of their characters aren't really as effective as the first season, and that just kind of sucks. Reasonably, probably when looking at it, it's like, well, what could we do for this season? I don't know. Let's just remember the first one and just kind of go and backpedal through things. But I thought there was some things that probably paid off in this season that they were working on from the first season, and I could appreciate the show for that. I guess is the real pull out of this review. So immediately, I would say that yeah, Casey is a very strong character. If anything, it seems like Doug is kind of taken out of his role of being a mentor to Sam, and he kind of has a much more of his own kind of story in here, even though he's tied to the rest of the family. He has his kind of he's much more on his own in this season, and I was just like, okay, why? He just kind of feels like a guy that's an island onto himself in this season, and I thought that that was just absurd. As well as Elsa is almost kind of getting in this season to be an almost island upon herself. It seems like we're just kind of seeing every single one of these characters to just be an island onto themselves instead of being all tied together as a family would, which I'm assuming ultimately when we get to the third season, it's going to even be more further separating all of these family members, and just we're going to have whole entire episodes that are probably just going to be askewed or whatever just to one person probably per episode, and it just it might feel like a bit of a stretching, or it might feel like a bit of a you're not exactly going in here anymore for the family dynamic. It's just oh, well, whichever character that you like. It's gonna turn into The Walking Dead, where after a while of having an ensemble piece, eventually they're gonna just turn to individual characters and have episodes probably dedicated to them. And I'm assuming that's what's going to happen in the future, so that way they can kind of just stretch some writing out a little bit more. But anyways, I hope not, but it might be that way. So I thought that I thought the ending of this season was really strong. I think Casey's journey was really strong. I think Sam ultimately, I want to say he was just also, even between Doug and Elsa, I think Sam was just a character that was just kind of there this season. Like, I think for Sam, I think for this season compared to the first, man, did it feel like there was a lot of just like stalling or just kind of like stuff to just kind of eat a lot of time with Sam in this season. And like, I thought that was horrible. I'm like, so you're gonna take Sam and make him be the person that is just gonna like kill time in this show. And that's the thing that I didn't like about his character in this season was like he was the killer of time in this season. To ultimately just kind of stretch episodes and have there be him needing to reasonably just go into here and just go through these rungs of things uh, just to have no real true legitimate outcome. And ultimately, where I loved Sam and Paige's relationship in the first season, in this second season, I was just like, man, this relationship just is kind of, it's kind of an like a little bit of an annoyance. It's just kind of really just, it's not as well put in the second season. It's just kind of like whatever it needs to be for the story. I like the fact that it seems like we have Taurus seemingly they kind of the relationship of Sam and Paige is a little bit loose, but when also looking at it, it just kind of ultimately feels like what they do towards the end of this season just kind of feels like, man, whatever the story needs to do just to kind of like kill some more time. Hey, let's kind of incorporate this person, incorporate that person into this, and sure, figure it all out. And like Casey, kind of like Casey, for all the good things that I have consistently said about her, like there is also a bunch of like kind of juggling going on with Casey, and like it seems like they didn't. It doesn't really seem like they were gonna pull the trigger on anything with Casey, and so reasonably it's kind of a juggled mess with Casey's story. Even though to me, like Casey has probably the best story out of everybody, but still, like her story also kind of feels like a juggling of balls. It makes no sense in the season to where it's ultimately just like, where the heck is she gonna land? Where the heck? What is going on here? If ultimately she was going to get really good potential with going to this school, but no, I think we have to do something else. So, anyways, that is all I wanted to really just kind of say in this season for a very cryptic like sense. So we'll eventually go into spoiler like sense. Yeah, I think reasonably, if in the first season it started to kind of spill out that like it kind of went from like Sam to family to community. Like I think in this season it was just kind of we went back into like family and then like side characters. Like it didn't really like nothing that any of these people did really affected the entire town, and it also seems that eventually that Doug ends up kind of incorporating a new person to the story. It seems like Sam incorporates some characters into his story because ultimately we'll talk about that in spoilers. So hopefully I'll get to that. So let's go into spoiler time. Let's go to that double five, and otherwise, I'm just gonna kind of tangent my way through this season. So at the end of the day, if you haven't watched this entire season, there might be points that I might kind of go through at some point through all this rigmarole and jibbity jaw of me talking. At the end of the day, if you have never seen this show before, and you're going into season two, which I'm confused about, definitely check out my season one review, and but just kind of go into it in Netflix and check it out. So without a doubt, let's go into that juicy five time of spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. Ultimate on Netflix. So go ahead if you like to check it out. So yeah, jumble messes, but reasonably so. Spoilers now for all of this show. So reasonably, in the very beginning of this, we have a closure moment of the big moment at the end of season one, where ultimately Elsa went home to see on her board stop effing the bartender, and we ultimately have Doug who's like, what does that mean? What does the note mean? And we ultimately have it to where now Elsa has to kind of go like, oh well, and Doug is like, you need to leave. You need to go. You cheated on me. How dare you? And even when eventually like we have it to where Elsa is trying to win some points in this season, Doug is like, well, yeah, but you didn't like you're still not really exactly winning me over. Like if anything, if you're gonna come in here and win some points, I'm just gonna give you a little pat on the head and just say, "Oh, good for you," kind of thing, and then walk away, kind of thing. It's really just Doug is gonna take it upon himself to just be like, you know what, I don't need you, Elsa. I'm just gonna do this whole family thing all by myself, and then ultimately I'm gonna have a panic attack somewhere in the season. So, so reasonably we have it to where the journey of the season is for Sam to find a new therapist, because ultimately Julie will not see Sam anymore. So reasonably we have it to where Sam ultimately is like, oh my god, I have no one to really talk to. I don't have Paige anymore because me and her are not going through a like they're having a very casual relationship. It seems like Sam and Paige can kiss one another, but reasonably they don't have much of a relationship past that. Uh, and so and so Sam needs to, one, find a therapist, and two, find someone that he can talk to, because eventually we have it to where Paige is like, no, you're not gonna hold my hand. No, we're not gonna talk to one another. No, like she basically breaks down all the rules to just be like, oh, you can't say anything emotional. You can't do this and that. Like she's telling basically Sam all the rules of their new casual relationship, and then eventually when Paige needs him, ultimately that's when Sam breaks down every single one of the rules that she is violating, and then she's like, well, maybe we can't do this casual anymore, like maybe we shouldn't even do it at all. And so we reasonably have it to where, so it seems Sam's life is spiraling out of control. He has no therapist. He ultimately has no Paige, and so since he has no one to really talk to, and he's just kind of bottling up all of his stuff inside, eventually he gets to the point where he puts his headphones on when everybody's shifting their desks in class, and ultimately we have it to where Sam is ultimately having his teacher having to take his headphones off. So We have it to where Sam just ultimately just kind of starts walking out of class to slowly but surely get hit by a car and then walk back into school to ultimately put his headphones on and kind of sit in some room where eventually he is to meet a girl named Bailey, which we kind of barely saw in season one, but I guess now she's going to have a much more prominent role. Prominent role meaning like she is going to ultimately showcase to us it's like, hey man, Sam is a really good artist. If we hadn't seen in Sam's notebook in season one where Paige was scrolling through the pages and like, oh my god, this is amazing artwork. We ultimately have it to where Sam in this season is like, yeah, I guess I'm a good artist. So how about I just go to school for that? So we have it to where ultimately Sam is kind of carving out his future in this season. We ultimately have it to where he is to run through all these therapists that he at some point does not like. There's little tiny bits of things that ultimately bother him. We have one therapist whose eyebrows are too big. We have one therapist who seems to have the characteristics of a rabbit, and so on and so forth. They're just a lot of therapists that ultimately are absurd and ultimately call him like champ and all these kinds of other things. So we eventually have it to where Sam is to go to this guidance counselor that ultimately has other kids that are just like him. And so instead of doing a individual therapy kind of session, which isn't really a therapy session at all, it's just kind of like everybody like talking or getting their feelings out and stuff like that, which ultimately I had when I was in school, I went and did this like group session thing of like grief counseling, where ultimately we just kind of all kind of went together and just kind of grieved about a person that we had lost. And I don't know, I think for me, I thought that that was ultimately like, no offense to the person that was running this thing, I just thought, I'm like, I don't really quite get this. I'm like, I don't really like. Yeah, it's good to remember the loss, but like reasonably, I'm just like I was thinking. I'm like, dude, I'm gonna eventually gonna move on. Like I'm gonna like reasonably. I just didn't quite understand like trying to consistently remember the person, and reasonably it was just kind of like it's just kind of reflecting on that loss and kind of keeping it in there repetitively, and it was just, I don't know, it wasn't a thing that really quite worked for me, so I was just like, nah. If anything, like the best thing about it, to be brutally honest, was just the fact that like I could get out of a certain class where the teacher I did not like. The teacher was just not nice, really. And there was sometimes several teachers were ultimately that was just like, I don't like this teacher at all. If anything, there's some teachers that ultimately cussed in certain classes and stuff like that. So yeah, I just was like, man, if only I could just get out of this classroom. Like it would be the greatest thing in life just to get out of this classroom with this teacher because she effing sucks. Because that's what she effing said. So she said the F word. That's what I mean. So I think there's some teachers that I think they need to realize that like that they need to get out at some point. They need to just kind of like do some alternative thing because I think they are just gonna uh, not be in best suited to teach the youth of America at some point uh, with the way that they kind of approach their attitudes of sorts. I had some amazing teachers. I had the most fun teachers in my life. Um, through most of my years, with the exclusion of some southern schools, which ultimately stuff happens. Let's just say. So, but moving on from my experiences. So, and going back into the show. So, we ultimately have it to where Sam is ultimately kind of concerned about what is to happen after he graduates, which is ultimately the guidance counselor is consistently calling the abyss of what is to happen after seemingly Sam graduates. It's gone to the abyss of the unknown, the unsuredness. So we ultimately have to where Sam is ultimately seemingly going into this group, and it seems that Sam is just kind of working some things out. He's talking about some things. If anything, it's kind of interesting that eventually we get it to where we see Julia, that was Sam's therapist, but no longer can be. It seems that Sam at some point was consistently calling Julia as a leaving message thing, and we just got this montage of Julia repetitiously hearing every single like time of which that that Sam had called at some point. I'm gonna sneeze here for a second. Okay, maybe not. So, anyways, we have it to where Julia is hearing these answer machines messages of Sam ultimately uh, learning everything from this season. Because at some point, we even have Sam learning how to lie. And justifiably, there is kind of one point where I didn't like how he lied, because ultimately we have it to where Sam and Paige's relationship is on the rocks, and you can kind of really just tell that Paige still likes Sam, and she is just kind of ultimately thinking in her mind, it's like, well, like, I want this to work out. Like, I want him to be after me again. I want him to chase after me. But Sam will never do that. Sam is not going to chase after Paige. And that's the thing that ultimately I'm just like, no, God. Because ultimately Paige wants him to chase after her, but it's just not going to happen. It's never going to happen. Sam is not having the ability to want and need to do that. And that's what I feel. That's why I feel so sorry for Paige. But when looking at it, I'm like, well, like, you could have just moved on. You could have made him jealous. You could have went with somebody else. But anyway, so here's the point of which that I'm going into here. So you ultimately have Sam, who is learning how to lie, and ultimately he is lying to Paige that he has some girl lined up, and ultimately he's having the time of his life with this other girl. Obviously, because you have to say obviously like 50 times, uh, and every single time that ultimately Paige keeps asking some question, it's like, even if the answer doesn't really ring true to obviously, Sam says obviously anyways. So you ultimately have it to where Paige just is chopping these papers in anger with this paper slicer thing, that ultimately she ends up chopping off the top of one of her fingers. To where ultimately she just passes out, and we ultimately just have Sam, who just walks out of the room like, meh. Like, dude, if I would have tried to like take care of her, because ultimately when looking at it, like, you could have really won her over by that, and just she would have just been like swooning and like, he took care of me while I passed out. But instead, Sam just like walks out like, nah, I don't want to deal with any of that. So similarly, it seems like Hazim or Hazid or uh, oh my god, Zahid, there we go. I'm like, what is his best friend's name? Zahid ultimately is consistently going into some portion of places where they work at, and he's consistently just smoking weed. Consistently. We have to our reasonably also Zahid seems like he's having much more like things going on into this season than he did previously. Like before, he was just the guy that Sam went to at work and was like telling him like exactly what had happened in episode prior or whatever as like a recap, I guess. But Zahid, ultimately in this season, we have it to where Zahid is ultimately smoking weed with Sam in a portion of like kind of back back environment where they have probably lunches and stuff, or where they have their breaks, and we ultimately have it to where eventually Sam's boss ultimately is checking on them, and we have it to where Zahid had ultimately lit up a joint, and Sam took the rap for Zahid so he wouldn't lose his job. And you ultimately have it to where Sam is like, yeah, he's just kind of spiraling down consistently to the point to where he's consistently having problems. We have it to where Bailey ultimately lights up a cigarette in here. And Bailey, of course, is just macking on Sam. Because ultimately, when Paige otherwise decides to not be in this relationship, you have it to where Bailey is just kissing Sam just because. Like, she really doesn't care. Ultimately, I know Bailey from the show Runaways. And ultimately, I'm like, okay, so she's, of course, getting a more prominent role now because she's an actual actor. And like, so I'm like, oh yeah, so of course they're kind of like, well, she's an actual actor. I guess we should have her in a more prominent role in this thing. So here we go. So Bailey ends up kissing Sam because she just wants to, and we have it to where Sam is kind of thinking, I'm like, he's thinking like, well, is this gonna be more? Like, are we just gonna like, are we gonna be a couple? And or what are we? And Bailey's like, no, I just want to kiss you, and that's it. And Sam's just like, okay, well, could I tell people that you and I kiss? And she's like, no. He's like, well, could I tell a person that I've been kissing someone, but I can't, but I'm not gonna say who it actually is. And that's where we have Bailey's like, I don't care. So we have it to where eventually Sam tells Paige that ultimately he is kissing somebody, but he can't tell her who that is, who that person is, and so Paige has to kind of figure it out. And so eventually she gets down to figuring out that it's Bailey, but nothing really comes down from that. But eventually we have it to where Bailey is lighting a cigarette in school, and so ultimately Paige ends up hitting the fire alarm and ultimately getting all these kids in trouble. So to where we ultimately find out that there's a bench that ultimately Paige had made for the school, and Paige is like, yeah, feel grateful that I had made this. Yeah, so grateful I feel. So because ultimately she was ultimately trying to sell cookies to everybody to make money for some fundraiser that she was doing for something else. So we have it to where eventually, okay, like we have to where Doug, let's kind of askew through all these stories in here now. So you ultimately have Doug, who is trying to do everything on his own now. He's ultimately having Elsa out of the house, and we have it to where Doug is ultimately just taking on all the chores and ultimately trying to uh, take care of Sam and take care of take care of Casey, but it kind of seems like he's very absent on that front. Like he's not 100% there, but like he's just kind of letting Casey do her thing, and like we have a tour just kind of Doug is just kind of like he's not as like 100% hands on with Sam, just because Sam is just kind of doing his own thing, and his own thing is perfectly fine. So you ultimately have it to where Doug is eventually more and more trying to do too much. He's starting to look sick, and eventually we have it to where Elsa is just kind of popping in to try to be a part of the household, and Doug is going to her and he's like, no, don't show up at my house. Like, if anything, like, I'm gonna give you some rules. Like you can show up at my house like hours before, or you have to give me like an hour, like hours notice before you show up at my house. You have to do like all this dancing around, because ultimately what Elsa did had really hurt Doug. So reasonably, he's like, I don't trust you. Like, I don't believe you. Like, I want you to jump through hoops to get back into this home, and if you're not willing to do that, then well, you're never gonna be back in this home again. So we ultimately have it to where Casey has really chosen Doug's side, and reasonably at some point when Doug's health starts to decline, Casey's really helping Doug just kind of with his issues, with his problems. And I thought that that was really fascinating. So, to the point where eventually when Doug ends up like falling over and with his a panic attack, we have to where Casey just kind of jumps in, and Evan calls 911. So we had it to where in the very beginning of this season, we have it to where ultimately Doug punches a hole in a wall, and like it kind of like they keep kind of consistently going back to that hole in the wall. We have it to where Elsa is like just putting a thing over it to cover it up, and Casey's just like, oh yeah, that's just gonna solve everything. And so like they keep coming back to this hole in the wall to where eventually Elsa is trying to fix it at some point, and we have it to where eventually Evan is going and actually going through and actually fixing it. So Elsa. So ultimately, Elsa is now off to live with one of her people. I'm assuming her sister, maybe. I don't know who that person actually was, and I don't want to spend the time to try to find it either. So Elsa ends up going off and living with someone, and we have it to her ultimately. Elsa is just she's not like going back with Nick and trying to cheat on him or whatever. She's just trying to win her family back. And so, reason we outro Elsa's story is just to try to uh, think that she could just, like, I guess, seduce people or persuade people into her good graces. We have to ultimately Elsa kind of sneaks in, makes food, and puts in the fridge to ultimately kind of seduce Doug and his family to have her come back, which ultimately that is not what they eat, and that's not what they do, is to ultimately get her back. Ultimately, they just order pizza, and everything is fine. Um, so eventually we have it to where Elsa is trying as much as possible to win over this family. She also feels like a cutting of her hair by having her have bangs in this season is ultimately going to win Doug over. Like, yeah, look at that haircut. Like, that's going to make a huge difference. But we have it to where Elsa is trying to win Doug over simply by, like, having lower cut tops and All these kinds of things just to think that like a appearance of something would seduce Doug. So, but that's just not going to work. We ultimately have eventually Doug going to some meeting and eventually meeting some gal that ultimately has a daughter that seems to love ambulances, and so ultimately Doug is offering to have this girl go on a ride along, and ultimately it seems like this girl eventually after this ride along loved this ambulance. So it seems that Doug is almost dating a woman and kind of seeing where this goes. Ultimately, Doug at some point had talked when ultimately mentioning the new rules that Elsa is to follow in her home. We find out that Doug had taken off his wedding ring, and so recently Elsa was just kind of distraught by that. So pushing on. So Elsa ultimately is trying to win Doug over, and reasonably we get it to her eventually that Doug is asking Elsa about the truth about her meeting this guy, like asking how good looking he was, asking who he was, eventually asking who had hit on who first, kind of thing. Like, and so reasonably have it to where Elsa's like, "Oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know, because I don't want to tell you the truth." So you ultimately have it to where Elsa is pushed into this season to try to win her family over, especially when any number of these family members eventually make a mistake. Doug ultimately has a panic attack, so Elsa kind of swoops in to try to help this family out, and it seems that reasonably Elsa is kind of giving Doug ideas to help out this family more, and ultimately he gives her a good old like pat on the head kind of thing to ultimately say, "Oh, good job, good job." So they ultimately have it to where also Elsa is to kind of help out Casey in a way of not like really yelling at her, but just kind of telling her, "Dude, you're grounded. Like you're stupid and you're grounded." We have to where eventually Casey just gets drunk in this season, and she gets far too drunk, and ultimately Elsa has to come and collect her from her boyfriend's room, and ultimately just kind of just take care of her, and ultimately just say, "Yeah, you're grounded." And ultimately Elsa has to call Doug to tell Doug that she is grounded. So speaking of Casey, let's get on to Casey's journey in this season. So we ultimately have it to where there is a bunch of people added just for the purpose of Casey, it seems like in this season. Like, who cares about anybody else? We just gotta have to really add a ton of characters for Casey to just bounce around with. So we have Casey in this new school. So reasonably that means that Casey has to have new friends. So we ultimately have it seemingly where we have a character named Izzy, and we also have a character called, I believe his name is Nate. I'm probably, yeah, Nate, where ultimately it seems like Casey is kind of clinging to one of her athletes that are ultimately in her track and field team. And eventually we get it to where we eventually have Casey who doesn't like this school at all. It seems like there is too many, if you want to call it hurdles to jump through. Like, this school has all kinds of hurdles. So we ultimately have Casey who there are very specific kind of patterns of days that ultimately go on to this school. Yeah, Casey has a uniform that ultimately had to be tailored by her mother, and so reasonably eventually we have Casey trying to go through this school, and it seems like there are at some days casual day, and there's also times when Casey has to get a certain kind of lunch, like reward system to be able to even get a lunch. It seems that ultimately, when like the first day we have Casey who brought her own lunch, but then eventually the second day around wants to pay for her own lunch, but ultimately they're mentioning it's like, well, you can only do a lunch through an award system or reward system. It's some kind of weird like bizarrish thing that they only have for this school. And so when eventually Casey ends up getting this reward card thing, ultimately it's not active till 48 hours, so she can't use it anyways. So this girl is ultimately just trying to just ultimately just have whatever granola bars or whatever that she had on her just to eat lunch, and ultimately we have Nate where eventually he orders a pizza for her so she can have something to eat. So we have to her eventually that it seems that there is some love triangle or love square thing that's going on because Casey is still in love with Evan, but also it seems that we have Casey that is also like looking at Izzy, and they're becoming way too good of a friends, even more than that. And we also have it where Nate is also kind of just looking at Casey and just going like, "Yeah, I'm gonna hit on you a lot. I'm gonna like have this kind of be like a very like obscure kind of relationship, and then ultimately I will kiss you, and then you're like, no, like I'm ultimately with so and so, or ultimately I'm just not finding you quite attractive enough." Because reasonably we have it where Izzy is ultimately gonna like mention that Nate is not really all quite cracked up what it's cracked up to be, but it just kind of seems like at some point that it seemed that Nate or Izzy was working Casey. It seems there is this bizarre thing going on with Nate and Izzy to go up against Casey. To be brutally honest, it seems like there is some kind of round and round they go with this whole thing, and it's gonna just end badly. So we eventually have it to where Evan is just to kind of connect with Casey with her friends at this establishment. And ultimately, while Evan is seeing all these people interact with one another, Evan is just kind of distraught about, like, you know what? It doesn't really feel like when I'm with you that ultimately we are boyfriend and girlfriend anymore. It kind of feels like, if anything, like you have your own people here, and I'm just not one of them anymore. And so eventually we have it to where Evan is kind of slowly but surely kind of realizing that he is on his way out of here because Casey deems it so. But it also seems that Casey is going to go out of her way to get really drunk with Izzy, and because ultimately what had happened was is that she had a problem with her track and field coach, which ultimately just landed her into hot water. To ultimately landed her and one other girl into detention, and so reasonably they ended up just kind of sneaking in some hooch into this detention, and they got really drunk, and we ultimately have it to where Casey eventually goes to Evan's room in his place, and ultimately is talking about sleeping with him and all kinds of other stuff. And so Evan ultimately is trying to just go, no, I don't want to sleep with you. I want to be the good guy here and not try to take advantage of you. And so ultimately we have to where Casey ends up passing out, and Evan calls Elsa to pick her up, and so we eventually have Casey who wakes up in Elsa's room. That ultimately she's like, oh, okay, like I get it. Like if anything, like you guys can make mistakes, but like that doesn't make it so you're not grounded. So pushing on. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Casey is to eventually kind of really cling on to Izzy to the point of them basically realizing that this is too good to be true. But it seems that Nate is kind of trying to put a fork in the road with this relationship to the point of him kissing Casey. And we have to where Izzy is now kind of not really liking Casey. Tells me we have to where her shoes say the word slut and hoe on them. So recently, eventually, Casey has to get new shoes, and we have to where Elsa is kind of saying like, "Yeah, I saw your shoes. I was gonna write like, screw you is on your shoes, but I don't think it would have fit on the shoes." So we have it where ultimately Casey is eventually like falling for Izzy, and towards the very end of the season, eventually they hold hands, and it seems like there's a really legitimate uh, relationship going on here. And we eventually see the phone call of Evan where Casey ignores it, and like, oh my god, this is crazy. So here's the tail end of this episode, or of this season, I should say. Really, the tail end of this season really coincides with a high school speech. We have to ultimately Paige is supposed to do a speech, but she can't. Because we ultimately find out that Sam had gotten a yearbook, and in that yearbook, there's all kinds of nicknames that ultimately people had said about him, called him a weirdo, a loser, or a spaz, or whatever. And we ultimately have to where Sam freaks out about all this. If not also to freak out about this season where ultimately he had got arrested at some point, and we have it to where Doug is trying to go to this police officer to try to better warn him about special needs people. That ultimately you can't just like approach them like any normal person, and so recently their goal is to try to figure out how to like figure out how to teach people how to respond to special needs people better. So we eventually have it to where ultimately Doug is or Doug Sam is getting this yearbook, and ultimately he is kind of just uh, upset about it. And we ultimately have to our Page yells and screams, "Who is the person that called him a loser or a spaz or whatever on his yearbook? How could you do that? Like, I wish you all would die," and rah rah rah. Like Paige goes into this whole huge like thunderstorm of a yell to where she basically butchers and destroys her voice while doing it. And we have it to where Sam stepping in to read Paige's speech, and we could kind of tell that every bit of the speech is tailored to not fit Sam. Ultimately, mentioning that, like, yeah, I can't believe how like I was a girl before, and now I'm growing into a woman kind of thing, and like ultimately he's consistently reading every single bit of the pieces, which I thought was fascinating or funny when ultimately he was like, hold for a pause, and ultimately everybody would be like, yeah, I guess we should all applaud. Like, he's reading all this and everybody's having a good laugh, which I think is the best part about all this. And we ultimately have it to where reasonably like Sam is giving a fairly interesting speech that has no tie to him otherwise, but he just wanted to do her speech. And eventually we have it to where Paige is so just incredibly grateful that Sam had done her speech for her. And Sam, we have it to where eventually he is telling her that it's like, well, the only reason that I was able to do this speech is because I love you. Like we have it to where Sam is really like going into like to bat for Paige in this season. We ultimately have even basically Sam being a bat of sorts in a baseball cage because he's getting hit with baseballs, in a batting cage because he's just wanting to release his anger. He's pulling the God, what is it? The Happy Gilmore kind of approach. Where ultimately, Happy Gilmore would just let baseballs hit him with this pitcher thing, so that way he could be prepared for hockey season. So we ultimately have a tour to where Sam is to ultimately be getting ready for college and to go to school for art, but ultimately he has a portfolio that ultimately gets missing, but ultimately he finds it again. So ultimately, Avatar Sam is supposed to make out a speech or make out a paper for ultimately a school to read. And reasonably, we have it to where Sam's greatest accomplishment is when he ultimately had talked to that lady that was next to that club of sorts, and she ultimately had uh, opened up her fur coat to have Sam see her chest. And ultimately, that is his greatest accomplishment that ultimately he had to say. And we have it to where ultimately Sam is wanting to write that, but instead everybody's like, no, how about you just lie about things? How about you just make something up? How about you just kind of like razzle and dazzle them? Because that's what you need to do. Like, you need to figure out some way to just kind of make them want you and stand out and so on and so forth. So eventually we have it to where Sam like comes up with this letter. So and we ultimately have Paige who ultimately wants Sam to go to her school and so on and so forth. So going into this, yeah, like the real tail end of this season is ultimately the similarly what's going to happen with the relationship of Casey, and that's just kind of like the tail end of this season. I kind of probably skipped around a lot and probably just kind of went through some things here and there. There's really just a lot of stuff that ultimately I kind of just skipped around about because it's a lot of montaging of things, or it's a lot of going back into things in this season. Um, but I still think that this season is pretty decent, even though I think the first season is a little bit better. Still, like, I think that this is a pretty interesting show. Uh, I think there was a lot of just like the whole relationship stuff was just a kind of like follow the bouncing ball of this thing because it's gonna keep like kind of going and having these ups and downs and this roller coaster ride of like just transition to this person, just transition to that person. It kind of feels like they had to transition to people just to keep the story interesting, and I just thought that that sucked. I just kind of thought that was annoying. That ultimately, it's like, oh, you need to add a person in here as a relationship buffer, and I just thought that, that was dumb. But other than that, I ultimately just kind of just I liked this season. I thought it was a fun season, and so, anyways, I think that's all I wanted to say about the season. I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Blah, 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 blah. Goodbye, everybody.